Hey Cheva, what's going on? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Zayin of Masechta Pesachim, Daf 7. Another great daf here, Masechta Pesachim, just one after the other, huh? So the Gemara begins with let's say like this. Yesterday we really kind of stopped in the middle of the sugya about doing Bitul hametz after bedikat hametz. We're going to continue with that sugya. We will discuss moldy bread. What happens if you find moldy bread on Pesach? What do you do? The Beracha on bedikat hametz. What is the Beracha that you make? Who knows? Quick, anybody tell me? Alright, we'll find out. Making brachas, right? Making a bracha over la asiyasan. I don't know if people heard that phrase, that we make brachas over la asiyasan. We're going to discuss that a little bit. And the reason why we do bedikat with a candle, which may make us a little bit nostalgic for Daf Nun Aleph of Masechta Eruvin. Let us move on. So, okay, I'm starting now. So, we're on Daf Vav Amud Beis. So, we began yesterday discussing the statement of Rav Yehuda in the name of Rav that after you do bedikas hametz, you immediately do a bitul. You say, any hametz that I have should be like the dust of the earth, right? Like it's not mine, I don't care about it. You know, if it does happen to exist, even though I've just searched for it and didn't find anything, in the event that there is chametz that I somehow missed, it should be null and void. So we're trying to figure out how come you have to do that, right? Meaning because, after all, you did just do a bedikat, you did just ascertain that you don't have any chametz. So why do you also now then have to take that additional step of saying everything is batal? So we suggested, well, maybe there are crumbs. But we then confirmed that crumbs really are irrelevant. So, Amar Rava, we are about 6 lines before it gets wide. Amar Rava gzer shemayimtza gluska yafe v'daite ilave. This is very interesting. So, or it's going to be getting more interesting. So, says Rava, well, we're concerned that maybe you missed a loaf of bread. Yeah, we're not concerned about crumbs. It's true, we're not concerned about crumbs. But what if you find a good geshmaka loaf of bread? Well, so the Gemara says, well, I'll tell you what you do. If you find a good geshmaka loaf of bread, be mevatel it. And then, problem solved. Well, dilma mishkachas le'levasur isura. Do you hear this? You heard this, right? Should I read it again? Dilma mishkachas le'levasur isura. Maybe he will find this loaf of bread after the time when it's asur, i.e. after 6 hours on Erev Pesach. V'lav b'shusei kaima. This is the interesting part. That after the zmana isur, after 6 hours, right? Once we hit the 6 hour mark on Erev Pesach, which I think would be noon, meaning you do bir chametz at the beginning of the 6th hour. In our perfect day, that would be 11 a.m. But I think it actually becomes mamish asur at 12 p.m. at the beginning of the 7th hour, I think. But the point is that if he finds this geshmaka loaf of bread after the point where it's already asur to have chametz, well then it won't be considered like it is his property anymore, right? It is going to be considered, right, because, and Rashi had said this also yesterday, that because it's asur b'hana, since after the 6 hours on Erev Pesach, the chametz becomes asur b'hana, you can't get any benefit from it. Therefore, it's not even considered like it's in your property anymore. V'lo matzi mevatel, and therefore you cannot be mevatel the chametz anymore. So the reason why we're mevatel our chametz, why we make it null and void and ownerless, hefker, immediately after we do bedikas chametz, is because we're concerned that what if you find a loaf of bread on the 4th on Erev Pesach, after, or really any time after chametz becomes completely asur. Well, if you find the loaf of bread at that point, well then you'll be unable to be mevatel it because it's no longer considered in your property, in your rishus. Now you might be thinking, well, if it's no longer in his rishus, well then what's the problem? I thought Ba'yira Ba'imatz is only problem if it's yours, but we're saying that once it becomes asur, it's not yours anymore. So now listen to this. The Amar Belazar, now says Belazar, Shnei Dvarim Einan B'Shuso Shel Adam V'Asana Kasav Kilu B'Shuso. There are 2 instances where you have something that isn't actually in somebody's property, and yet we treat it as though it is in his property so that we can get him in trouble. And here, ve'eluhen, these are the examples. These are the instances. Bor b'reshus harabim v'chametz misheshos u'l'mayla. Those two instances are, number one, a pit in the Reshus Harabim, a big open gaping pit, like I once experienced in Indonesia in, I think it was Ubud. I was walking down the sidewalk on a busy street. There's Pashit, a pit. Yeah, I put it on Instagram even, I think. Instagram story. I think I put it over there and I said, Mama Shabor B'Reshus Harabim. I think that's what happened. Anyways, so what were we saying? So Reshus Harabim, of course, is not any one person's domain. So theoretically, if I dig a pit in Reshus Harabim, it's not mine, it's in the Reshus Harabim. It's public property, it's not my pit. But since I dug it, if somebody falls in there, it'll be considered mine to the extent that I'll have to pay damages. And the other example is this exact example. If you find a loaf of bread in your house or whatever on Erev Pesach, once or on Pesach, whatever it might be, meaning at any point after Pesach becomes completely asur midah oraisa, well, even though it's technically not yours because it's asur b'anoah and it's not in your reshus, you're still going to be over on Bal Yirah and Bal Yimatzeh if you find it. And therefore, to prevent, so you won't be able to be mevatel because it's not in your reshus, to be mevatel, yet you're still going to be responsible for it and you're going to be over on Bal Yirah, Bal Yimatzeh. Therefore, to prevent the situation, we are mevatel the hametz immediately after bedikas hametz. V'nivadli ba'arba, v'nivadli b'chamesh. So the Gemara says, okay, fine, great, understood. But why do we have to do bitul hametz immediately after bedikas hametz? Can't I be mevatel my hametz any time before 6 hours on the next day? As Rashi says, as the Gemara says, v'nivadli ba'arba. Let him be mevatel his chametz on 4 hours into the day on Erev Pesach, or what about 5 hours into the day? You really just have to be mevatel your chametz before it becomes asur in the 6th hour. So the Gemara answers, Kevin de lavzman isurahu v'lavzman biurahu l'mapasha v'l'mevatele. So the Gemara says, well, technically, you're right. Technically, he can just be mevatel his chametz in the 4th hour, the 5th hour, anytime before it becomes asur. However, we're looking for an anchor. We're looking for a hook. We're looking for, if we're looking for something that we can pin it together with, such as bedikas hametz, that we could say, look, right after you do your bedikas hametz, just be mevatel it then, do it, make it a package, do it all together, that way you don't forget. However, if we just say, be mevatel your chametz at 4 hours into the day, you might forget. There's nothing else going on, right? So therefore we say, look, once already you're doing bedikas hametz, right? And everyone's going to do bedikas hametz. So immediately after you do bedikas hametz, just be mevatel your chametz then as well, and that way you won't forget, as opposed to like in the middle of the morning on Erev Pesach, it's a busy day, you might end up forgetting to be mevatel, which can create a headache. V'nivatle b'shis, the Gemara then suggests, well, why doesn't he be mevatel his chametz at the time of the biur, right? At the beginning of the 6th hour, he burns his chametz. He does biur chametz, which we said is sreifa, his burning it. Rashi also says over here that it's a reference to sreifa, to burning his chametz. So why don't we say, look, how about this? When he burns his chametz at the beginning of the 6th hour, let him also be mevatel it then. And there's your anchor. There's your package that you can package it together with. Package it together with burning your chametz at the beginning of the 6th hour. Be mevatel your chametz then. So listen to what the Gemara answers. Kevin the isur de rabbanan ilave kidorais adamya v'lav b'reshusei kaima v'lo matzi mevatel. So the Gemara says, well, since already we had said that there's machlokas between Reb Meir and Reb Yehuda about when do you have to stop eating chametz. Reb Meir said at the beginning of the 5th hour, Reb Yehuda said at the beginning of the 4th hour, but everyone agrees that already at least by the 5th hour you have to stop eating chametz. And therefore, since already at that point it's also midrabanan, so therefore we treat it like kol de takun rabbanan kein d'oraisa takun, although nobody said that over here, but we want to treat it right, kid d'oraisa damer. We treat it as though it's d'oraisa, it has the same stringencies, and therefore at that point it would already not be considered as though it's not, it would already be considered as though it's not in your property, and therefore you would be unable to be mevatel at that point, at the time that you burn it. And therefore the best thing that we could think of is to say, be mevatel your chametz immediately after you do the bedikat the night before. Domer of Gidol Amarab, Fchia Bar Yosef Amarab says, often Rav Gidol is quoting Rav, but over here Rav Gidol is quoting Rav Fchia Bar Yosef in the name of Rav. Okay, Hamakadesh Misheshos Ulamayla, somebody who betroths a woman on on Erev Pesach from 6 hours and up, i.e. once chametz is already asur midoraisa, afilu bechite kordenisa, even if he is using wheat of kordenisa, this is like very strong wheat that water doesn't penetrate very well, but it was wet, so nonetheless, ein choshesh in the kiddushin, this kiddushin is, there's no chance that this kiddushin worked because he was mevatel somebody with something that's asur ba'ana. So we see that already once something is, that after 6 hours on Erev Pesach, chametz is not considered in your reshus anymore, and therefore you can't be mekadesh a woman, even, and you know that even with this wheat, which you can make the argument that it's like very thick wheat and the water won't get in and won't become chametz, doesn't matter. You know, anything that even smells of chametz is not considered in your reshus. If you're mekadesh a woman with it, try just using like money or something. So now the Gemara asks, 1 second. After 6 hours on Erev Pesach, right? Once chametz is asur on Erev Pesach, he's unable to be mevatel the chametz at that point. We learn in the Brayso, oh, if you have a yid, he was Erev Pesach, he was being a good boy, staying out of trouble, and he went to the Beis HaMedrash. Well, we don't know if it was Erev Pesach. Let's see. He went to the Beis HaMedrash, v'nizkar sheish chametz b'soch beiso, and he remembers, oy va'avoy, there's chametz in my house, mevatlo belibo. So he just he's mevatel it. He just says, okay, well, as far as I'm concerned, that chametz is null and void, is batal, it's like the dirt of the earth. Echad Shabbos v'echad Yom Tiv, and this is whether it's Shabbos or whether it's Yom Tiv. So here's the question. Bishlama Shabbos, I understand Shabbos, right? Meaning, remember, we are saying that from 6 hours and on Erev Pesach, once chametz becomes asur midoraisa, you're unable to be mevatel it. So now, this guy, he's in the Beis HaMedrash and he's learning. He realizes that he has chametz, so he's mevatel it. And this could be either on Shabbos or on Yom Tiv. So now, the Gemara says, I understand if it's Shabbos, mishkachas lakagon shechol arba asur lios b'Shabbos, right? I get it. It's Shabbos and it's Erev Pesach, and it's before 6 hours in the day, and he realizes, oh, shnaikis, I have at home some chametz, so he's mevatel it, and it's before the time that it's asur, so therefore he's allowed to be mevatel the chametz. Fine, that's fine. El Yom Tiv, but Yom Tiv, what are we talking about Yom Tiv? What, the first day of Pesach? Obviously, that's after the Zman Habir. Obviously, that's, right, at that point, chametz would be asur ba'ana, it would be asur midoraisa, and yet we're still saying that he's able to just be mevatel it. So, basar isuru, so it's after the Zman Isur, and still he's able to be mevatel it. So, Beracha bar Yaakov, says Beracha bar Yaakov, hacha b'talmud yoshev l'fnei rabo askinan. No, what this is talking about, you have a student, and he's sitting before his Rebbe, and he's in the middle of a shir, and he can't just get up and leave to go deal with this chametz. V'nizkar sheish isa megugeles b'soch beiso, and he remembered that he has dough that's at his home rising. So it's not yet chametz. So it's the first day of Pesach, it's Yom Tiv, and he has some stuff in his house that is not yet chametz, but it's rising, and if he doesn't run back and take care of it, it's going to turn into chametz. He's concerned that it might become chametz. So what the Brisa is saying is that he should be mevatel this dough from his heart before it becomes chametz. Meaning, so if it was actual chametz, he would be unable to be mevatel it. But this is talking about dough that was rising and is not yet actual chametz. But if he doesn't hustle and get home and throw it in the oven or something, it'll become chametz. But he's in the middle of a shir and it's disrespectful to walk out in the middle, so he's just mevatel it beforehand. But if it was actual chametz, he would be unable to be mevatel it after 6 hours on Erev Pesach. Dekanami, you can also infer that this is what's going on. It says that he was sitting inside the Beis HaMedrash, meaning he was sitting there, and meaning if it was actual chametz or whatever, then what's the difference where he is? The point is that he was sitting in the Beis HaMedrash and he was like stuck in a shir. He was in a situation where like he couldn't get out of it, and because he couldn't get out of it, there was some nafka min ha'ayid that this dough is going to rise and turn into chametz, and that's why he's mevatel it. But if it was just mamish chametz, he would be unable to be mevatel it once it's asur midoraisa. Alright friends, now we move on to the sugya of moldy bread / matzah, meaning if you find some moldy stuff on Pesach, what do you do? So Amar Rabba bar Rav Huna, Amar Rav, hapas she'ipsha, if you have moldy bread, kevan she'rab sa matzah muteris. So the assumption for now means that since it is in a container, some kind of, let's call it a box, since it's in a box that is generally used for matzah, therefore you can assume that this moldy item is matzah and it's not chametz, and it's muteris. Okay? Heichidami. Now, what exactly are we talking about? Well, if you know for sure that this thing in the box is like mamish bread, and it's moldy bread, well then the fact that this box is usually used to store matzah makes absolutely no difference. It's going to be asur because it's bread. So so it must be rather that we don't actually know if this thing in the box is chametz or if it's matzah, and therefore we're saying that since this box generally stores matzah, that's why we can assume that it's moldy matzah and it's mutar. My area kirabsa matzah, afilu kilorabsa matzah, but nami nasal basar basra. So the Gemara says, but the truth is that if we don't know for sure that it's bread, we don't know what it is, well then it would be completely irrelevant if this box is generally used for matzah or not. Because what you would do is you would just go based on what is the most recent thing that would have been put in there, right? Meaning, since you already did bedikas hametz mistama, so you can assume that any hametz that would have been there before Pesach was already removed, and therefore it makes sense to assume that whatever is in there right now would be matzah, right? And we're going to prove it right now. Milo tanan, because after all, don't we have a Mishnah that says Mos shenimtzu lifnei suchari behema laolam meiser. So if you're in Jerusalem and you find some money before an animal merchant, you have to assume that it's meiser money. Why? How come? We're talking about meiser sheni, right? Chaver, we all know, of course, by now that meiser sheni is that, right, when a person has a field, first he takes truma, then he takes meiser, and then on years 1, 2, 4, and 5, he takes meiser sheni. Okay, now that right, so truma is like 2%, let's say, and then meiser is going to be another 10%, the meiser sheni is the next 10%. You take that 10% of your crop, you bring it to Jerusalem, and you eat it in Jerusalem. However, you can, if you don't want to schlep over the whole crop, you can just convert the crop to money, bring that money to Jerusalem and spend it on food. So now, because all this meiser sheni money was happening around, being brought to Jerusalem, particularly around the Shalosh Regalim, around the festivals. So what the Mishnah is saying is that if you just find money on the floor in front of an animal merchant, so you have to assume that this money actually was coming from somebody who came to Jerusalem with meiser sheni money and went to an animal merchant to buy an animal, and his meiser sheni money fell on the floor, and this money is actually meiser sheni money, and you have to treat it accordingly. You can only spend it on food and things like that. So Bahar Habayis, now interestingly, what if on Har Habayis, on the Temple Mount, you find some money? Chulin. So we assume that it is chulin, that it is not meiser sheni money, because by the Temple Mount, it could just be some money that fell out of somebody's pocket. And now, if it was the Shalosh Regalim, if it was the 3 festivals, well, that's a very popular time for people to bring their meiser sheni money, right? Imagine you live far away, and in order to get to Jerusalem, you can't just drive your car, you have to, walk or take your donkey or something like that. It's a schlep. But you're going to Jerusalem anyways for the, 3 festivals per year. So you just save your money, and when you go for the festival, that's a good opportunity to buy meiser sheni money. So therefore, technically, if you would find it during the 3 festivals, there's reason to assume that the money that you'll find is meiser sheni money. However, even if you find it on the temple, if you find the money on the Temple Mount, the fact of the matter is the majority of the days of the year are not the 3 festivals, and you can assume that this money fell on the floor already before the festivals began. So therefore, if you find this meiser sheni if you find money on Har Bayis, you can assume that it's just regular old money. It's not Meiser Sheni money. Now, B'Yerushalayim, if you find money just lying on the floor in Yerushalayim, not in front of an animal merchant, and not on Har Bayis, just somewhere else, I don't know, Ben Yehuda Street, so then B'Shas HaRegel, Meiser. So if it is the Shalosh Regalim, so then you have to assume that this money is Meiser Sheni money that somebody brought to Jerusalem. B'Shar Yemos HaShana Chulin. Now, the rest of the days of the year, you have to assume, the rest of the days of the year, you can assume that it is just regular money, not any special Meiser Sheni money. V'amr of Shmaya Bar Zera, my taima. And if Shmaya Bar Zera says, what's the difference between the Shalosh Regalim and the rest of the year? That since every single day the markets and the streets of Jerusalem are swept, so alma amrinon kamoi azle le. So we say that any coins that would have been there earlier would have been swept away. And these are different coins. So therefore, and we'll talk about the Temple Mount for a second, because you might be thinking, well then, how come there's only this difference when it comes to the streets of Jerusalem to like Ben Yehuda Street, but not necessarily the Temple Mount? We'll get there in a second. But let's focus on Ben Yehuda Street for a second. So if I find some money on Ben Yehuda Street, just some random money, so the question is this money Meiser Sheni money, or is this money Chulin money? Is it regular money? Can I do whatever I want with it? So we say, if it's the Shalosh Regalim, so then you have to assume that it's Meiser Sheni money, because you have a huge influx of people and they're bringing their Meiser Sheni money with them. However, if it's the rest of the year, you can assume that it's just regular Chulin money. And the question is, why? So we say, well, because the streets are swept every single night. And, if it was from before the Regel, if it was from before the holiday, it would have already been swept away. So you can assume that whatever money you're finding right now is from today, is recent. And therefore it's going to be, since all these people are coming for the Shalosh Regalim, therefore you can assume that it's Meiser Sheni money. The rest of the year, where you don't have this huge influx of people with their Meiser Sheni money, you can assume that it is regular money. On the Temple Mount, however, they don't sweep the Temple Mount every day because it was on a certain angle and people are washing their feet anyways when they come in, so they don't necessarily sweep the Temple Mount, and that is why you wouldn't necessarily assume that even on the Shalosh Regalim, you wouldn't assume that this money that you found is Meiser Sheni money. Fine, Beseder. What's important for us is that you can make the assumption that this money is based on whatever it is today, whatever is going on today. Okay? And therefore, Hachanami here also, when it comes to this box that has this moldy bread in it, Nema Kama Kama Azil Behaida Idna Hu, let's say that whatever was there initially would have been removed during bedikat hametz and during all of our preparations for Pesach. Now it's Pesach and you find some random moldy bread over there. The question is it hametz or is it matzah? You can assume that just like when you find money in the street on Shalosh Regalim, that it's Meiser Sheni money, and not the Shalosh Regalim, you can assume that it's regular money. So here also, if you're finding a random piece of moldy bread and you don't know if it's chametz or matzah, you can assume that it is matzah. And therefore, the question is, what is the significance of the fact that we said that since this box is generally used for matzah, that is why you can assume that this moldy bread is in fact matzah. The fact, whether or not this box is used for matzah is actually irrelevant, because either way, let's just say he already did a bedikat chametz before Pesach, and mistama, whatever this bread is, it's matzah. So the Gemara answers, Shani Achad Ipusha Mochiach Ilave. Well, this is unique in that we're not talking about fresh, delicious, hot bread. We're talking about old, non-delicious, non-fresh, moldy bread. And therefore, clearly it's got some age on it, and therefore we have reason to assume that it's actually chametz, and we're saying that because it is in a box that's generally used for matzah, we'll assume that it is matzah. Ipusha mochiach ilave kirab sa matzah mayhave. But the Gemara is not convinced, because it says, well, if what you're saying is correct, or what you're pointing out is correct, which is this is really moldy matzah, well then I don't care that it's in a box that's usually used. I mean, if you're saying that this thing is all moldy, I don't care that it's in a box that's usually used for matzah. It's clearly chametz. It's clearly moldy bread. So Amarabu lotema sherab sa matzah ela ema sherabu yimei matzah ilave. Oh. So Rabbah comes and he says, no, you're understanding it wrong. Don't say that it's talking about a box that is generally used for matzah. That's not what it means. It's talking about shirabsa matzah, meaning shirabu yumei matzah ilave, meaning there's a bunch of days that you're already in the middle of Pesach, right? And therefore there was enough time for matzah to theoretically have gotten moldy. Now, the matzah that we use generally doesn't ever get moldy, but okay. But over here we're saying that shirabu yumei matzah, that there was enough days of Pesach that you could have had matzah sitting there that it could have gotten moldy, and that is why we can assume that it is matzah. Iachi pshita. Well, if that's the case, then obviously we can assume that it's matzah. So lo tzricha de ipushim meruba. So the Gemara says, yeah, but this is talking about where there was quite a bit of mold. Ma'udetema, I may have thought to say, kim de ipushim meruba igal yemilsa devadei chametz ma'al yehu. So I may have thought to say that, well, since there's so much mold on this thing, it certainly must be chametz. Kamash malon, therefore it's letting us know, kevan shirabu yemei matzah ilave, even though there's tons of mold on this item, since there have been a number of days of Pesach already, aminan, we say, kol yoma v'yoma naima chamima afa, that every single day there was like some fresh, I guess, matzah that was baked, v'shada ilave, and they threw it on top of this matzah, v'ipsha tfei, and it got very, very moldy. Okay, great, very good. So if you find this moldy item on Pesach, you can assume that it is moldy matzah. Okay, but one second. This whole concept that we just had, that we proved based on the Meister Sheni money in Jerusalem, that we go based on the most recent thing, is that really true? Do we really go based on like the most recent context, and therefore in our case we'll assume that what we found is matzah? But we learn in a brayso, Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda Omer, teva shenishtamshu b'maos chulin u'maos meiser, a box that they use both for chulin and for meiser. Imrov chulin, if the majority of it is chulin, well then it's chulin, and rov meiser. Meaning if they usually use this box for chulin, well then you can assume that what you found in there is chulin. If they usually use this box for meiser, then what you found in there you can assume is meiser. Ve'amai lezu basar basar. The question is, why are we going after rov over here? Why are we going after, well, if you usually use it for chulin, then you can assume that it's chulin. If this box is usually used for meiser, then you can assume that it's meiser. Forget about rov. Why don't you just go based on what was put in there last? Whatever, if there was meiser put in there last, you can assume that it's meiser. If there was chulin put in there last, you can assume that it's chulin. So Rav Nachum bar Yitzchak says, Rav Nachum bar Yitzchak, hachav ma'eskinin kagon shenishtamshu b'maos chulin u'maos meiser ven yodea eze me'em basof. So it says Rav Nachum bar Yitzchak, it's talking about where you just don't know which one was last. It's used for meiser, it's used for chulin, you don't know which one was put in there last. So, it's not like, let's say, Pesach, where you know that, based on the current events, it's objectively now Pesach. You know that you did a bedikat, so therefore you can assume that this is matzah. But over here, like, I don't know, randomly, I guess it's used for chulin, randomly it's used for meiser, you don't know which one was in there last. Rav Zvid Omar, kagon shenishtamshu bat tziburin. Rav Zvid says it's talking about where there was, in this box, there were like piles, and one pile was meiser, one pile was chulin, and now here's a little bit of something in the middle, you don't know which one it came from. Rav Papa Amar kagon de'ishtekach beguma. Rav Papa says that it's where you found this where you found whatever you found was in some kind of a hole in this box, and therefore it's quite possible that even if, let's say, you know that the last thing that was there was let's say chulin, but still, it's possible that because this thing was found in like a hole in the box, maybe it's actually been there for quite a while and just fell through the cracks for a while, and maybe even though the last thing that was in there was chulin, but maybe it might actually be meiser, and it just got stuck in the cracks and got missed. So, okay, but I guess in general you would be able to go based on what the last thing was. Okay, now we get up to what is the bracha that you make on bedikas chametz. So Rav Yehuda says that somebody who does a bedikas chametz, he also needs to make a bracha. My Mavarich, what's the bracha? So Rav Papi Amar Mishmei Derava Levayer Chametz. Rav Papa Amar Mishmei Derava Al Bir Chametz. Interesting. So we have machlokas between Rav Papi and Rav Papa, and then in the name of Rava. Okay, fine. So Rav Papi says that the bracha is Levayer Chametz. Rav Papa says, which is what we do, Al Biur Chametz. Now, B'levayer Kule Amalo Pligi Divadi Lahaba Mashma. So now the girsa of Levayer Chametz, to burn Chametz. Everyone agrees that is lihaba mashma, that is in the future, right? That I'm going to burn my chametz, and that's accurate. That's correct. We want it to be in the future because you haven't yet burnt the chametz. So you make the bracha of livaer chametz, that I will in the future burn the chametz. Okay. Kiplige, where Rav Papi and Rav Papa argue is be'al biur, is regarding the bracha of al biur. Marsaver meikar mashma, marsaver lahaba mashma, that Rav Papi says that al biur chametz implies past tense, and you didn't yet actually burn the chametz yet, so therefore it doesn't make sense, and therefore you have to say livaer chametz. Rav Papa says that al biur even is also on the burning that will take place in the future, and that is why you could say al biur chametz. Okay. Now we're going to ask a number of questions on Rav Papi, who says that al biur chametz would be the past tense. Meisvei, kasha number 1. Baruch Asher Kedishanu B'Mitzvosav V'Tzvanu Al Hamila. When it comes to bris milah, so the Moel says Al Hamila. Now he hasn't yet done the circumcision yet, so therefore, according to Rav Papi, if Al Biur Chametz is past tense, well then Al Hamila should also be past tense, in which case it wouldn't make sense. So Hasam Eichinema. So Rav Papi would say to you, well, yeah, I agree that theoretically he would say lamul, but lamul wouldn't work, right? What would he say? Nema lamul lo sagi de lav iu mahil. The assumption is that lamul would imply that he, the mohel, has the mitzvah to circumcise this kid, but the fact of the matter is that that's not true. It's the father who has the mitzvah to do bris milah for this child, and therefore lamul would not work for the mohel. And therefore, he's just the messenger of the father, and therefore al hamila is more appropriate. Avia ben Michael Meimar. Yeah, but what if the father is the mohel? In that case, lamul would make sense because after all, it is his commandment to do the bris. So enachinami. The Gemara says, yeah, in that case, meaning Rav Papi would answer like, yeah, in that case, lamul would be a more appropriate bracha, just like he says levayer chametz is a more appropriate bracha. Okay. Meisvei, we have a kasha baruch Hasher kedishanu b'mitzvosav v'tzvanu ala shchita. What about when it comes to shchita? So we say ala shchita, but he hasn't yet slaughtered the animal. So asam nami, there also heichinema nema lishchot. What are you going to say? Should the shochet say lishchot, which would imply that it's his mitzvah to do this shchita? Losaga delav iu shachat. Does he have to do the shchita? Is it his mitzvah per se, specifically? Meaning, if I take a sheep or something and I go to a shochet and he shechts it for me, I mean, it's not his mitzvah per se. I also have a mitzvah to do shchita, right? So lishchot wouldn't make sense. Therefore, it says ala shchita. Pesach v'kodshim ma'ikal meimar. Yeah, but what about, let's say, korban Pesach or kodshim, where I do have the mitzvah to shecht my own korban? So therefore, should I say lishchot? Say nachinami. So Rav Papi would say, yeah, lishchot would be a better bracha in that case if I'm shechting my own Pesach or kodshim. Meisvei, we have a kasha. Ha'osa lulav la'atzmo. Somebody who makes his own lulav, mevarich shechianu v'kimanu v'giyanu lazman hazeh. Or somebody who's making his lulav, he says the bracha of shechianu. Nitalu latzezbo. If he picks it up in order to be mekayim the mitzvah of shaking the lulav, omer asher kedishanu v'mitzvosav v'tzvanu al natilas lulav. So he says the bracha of al natilas lulav. Why doesn't he do lintol lulav? Right? Because at that time he hasn't yet been yosei the mitzvah. Shani yosin debina de agba nofag beis. So the Gemara says, actually, interestingly, at the time that he picked it up, he was already yosei the mitzvah, right? Because it's anatilas lulav. I'm picking up the lulav. So by the time he picked it up, he was actually already yosei the lulav, the mitzvah. So therefore, al natilas lulav, Rav Papi would say that it's past tense, and it actually makes sense here because by the time he picked it up, he was already yotze the mitzvah. So by the time he makes by the time he makes the bracha, he was already yotze the mitzvah. So anatilas lulav would be past tense, and it makes sense. If that's the case, latzes bo yotze bo mi baile. Meaning, so then if that's the case, well then the brisa, which says that if he picks up his lulav in order to be yotze the mitzvah of lulav, that's actually not correct. It should say when he picks up the lulav yatzabo, not latzesbo, but yatzabo, he already is yotze. So einachinami, the Gemara says, yeah, you're right. That would actually technically be more accurate. So why does it say latses? Why doesn't it say yatza? Well, umishum de kabay lemisna seifa leishev basuka tanaresha nami latzesbo. Well, since in the continuation of this brisa, it's gonna talk about the mitzvah of sitting in the sukkah, where it says leishev basuka, so it also says in the Reisha latzes bo, even though technically yatza bo would be more accurate. The Katani Seifa, as it says in the Seifa, ha'osa sukkah la'atzmo, somebody makes his own sukkah, he says Omer Baruch Ata Hashem Shechyanu v'kimanu v'gyanu lezman hazeh nichnash leishev ba. If he now goes into the sukkah in order to sit there, Omer Baruch Asher kedishanu v'mitzvosav v'tzivanu leishev basukkah. V'hilchasa al biur chametz. Now the halacha is, what bracha do we make? The bracha of al biur chametz, that like Rav Papa says, and I guess that would imply that it is in the future, and therefore that is also why all these other brachos like al amila, al shchita, al natilas lulav. Well, al natilas lulav is actually more interesting because theoretically we're arguing that he was already yotze the mitzvah when he picked it up, but maybe we're going back on that. Right? Maybe that was just a way to explain Rav Papi, but maybe that's an interesting question, right? Because we're saying that al biur chametz implies the future, so then al natilas lulav should theoretically also imply the future. So maybe when we said that once you pick it up you're yotze the mitzvah of lulav, maybe that's not actually true, but I don't know. We'd have to see. Let's move on. Okay, but everyone, whether you say that the bracha is liva er chametz or al biur chametz, everyone seems to be of the opinion, however, that you do need to make a bracha. Okay, so right, everyone agrees that you're going to be making a bracha before bedikas chametz. Now, minalan, how do you know that you make a bracha beforehand? So the Amar of Yudah Amar Shmuel, kol ha-mitzvahs mivarech alein over la-asiyason. This is a somewhat well-known statement that on all mitzvahs you make a bracha before you do the mitzvah. So my mashma, the high over lishna da kedumehu. Okay, so now the Gemara wants to know, how do we know that over means beforehand? So Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, to Amar Kra, says Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. It's nice that we've been seeing Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak around a lot recently. We had him a lot in Masechta Shabbos, but he wasn't around too much in Masechta Eruvin, I don't think. Maybe Eruvin isn't his thing. I hear you, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. But anyways, it's nice to see him back. And Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak is great. Remember him from Masechta Shabbos, he was the Mari de Uvda. He was a very good Balmidas. We also said at the end of the Masechta that I think he was born in a certain constellation or something like that. So his mother was very nervous that he was going to be a nudnik. So she always made sure that he was wearing like a kippah or something, a yarmulke, I think. One time I think his yarmulke fell off, and then he went to like... That was a loud motorcycle. The one time his yarmulke fell off, and then he went to like climb up a tree to like steal dates or something. Yeah. Anyways, this is Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. So the Amar Krai says that the pasuk says vayaretz, that the pasuk says vayaretz achimaetz derech hakikar, that achimaetz ran sort of the shorter way, vayavor es akushi, and he passed this kushi who was sent before him. So we see that vayavor means to precede. Abaye Amar mehacha vu over lifneim. Abaye says that it comes from when Yaakov Avinu was going to greet Esav. It says that he passed before them. V'bai sema, or if you want, I will say mehacha from here. Vayavor malkum lifneim v'Hashem berosham, that their king passed before them and God was at their head, referring to the Melech HaMashiach. So we see that over means before. So when we say you make a bracha over l'asiyasam, it means that you make a bracha before you do the mitzvah. Be'Rav Amri, they said by the Besmedrash of Rav, chutz min atvila v'shofar, that the exceptions are going to the mikvah and blowing shofar. That when you go to the mikvah, you make the bracha afterwards, and when you blow the shofar, you make the bracha after tkiyas shofar. Okay, now we're gonna have to figure out what this means, because if maybe people are thinking, but don't we make a bracha before Tkiyas Shofar? Okay, good question. So I understand why you would make a bracha on going to the mikvah only afterwards, because at the time before you go to the mikvah, you're not yet in a place where you should be making a bracha, right? As Rashi points out, we learned in Masechta Brachas and Daf Chaf that Ezra made a takana that a balkari, a man who has seen sperm emission, so he shouldn't learn Torah or make brachas. So therefore, before he goes to the mikveh, he's not able to make a bracha. But only after he goes to the mikveh can he make a bracha. So therefore, that's why you make a bracha after going to the mikveh. But El Shofar, my time, how come you make a bracha on the shofar after the fact? And if you're going to say, well, because what happens if you mess up the tkiyas? What happens if you don't do a good job? What happens if you're not actually yotze the mitzvah? It's risky to make the bracha beforehand when it comes to tkiyas shofar, because if you don't actually succeed, well then maybe you made a bracha levatala. So therefore make the bracha afterwards. But what about when it comes to shchita or bris milah? What if you mess up? But okay, what if you mess up? Well then maybe you made a bracha levatala. If you mess up, there's probably other issues. In any event, so Amr Rav Chizda chutz min atfila b'vad. So if Chizda clarifies and he says, no, drop shofar. Yeah, it's true. You make a bracha before tkiyas shofar. Don't worry about it if you mess up. Hopefully you won't mess up. Have shtickle confidence. And then, but by tefillah it makes sense. Make a bracha afterwards, because beforehand you were unable to make a bracha because you were about carry. Fine. Idmar, it was stated Tanan Amiyachi, we also in a brayso like this, Tov of Allah Ba'aliyaso Omer Baruch Hashem Kedushanim Mitzvos Vitzvano Ala Tefillah, that if you have a fellow who goes to the mikveh, so then when he comes out of the mikveh, he makes the bracha of Ala Tefillah. L'or aner, friends, says so our Mishnah had said that you do bedikas hametz to the light of a candle. The question is, how do we know, Minan Emile, how do we know that you do bedikat to the light of a candle? Amr of Chizda, this is very interesting. Lamadnu mitzia mi mitzia, mitzia mechipos v'chipos mechipos v'chipos mineris v'neris miner. Got it? Good. What's interesting about this is that we had another funny kind of similar thing like this in Masechta Eruvin on Daf Nun Aleph. That we said, how do we know that the Tchum Shabbos is 2,000 Amos? And we had something similar also, like this from this and that from that, and this from this and that from that, dot. So I looked it up today, and it was also Rav Chizda, which is very interesting. But anyways, Amar Rav Chizda says Rav Chizda, Lamanu Metzia mi Metzia. So it says Metzia in two different places, Metzia mechipos, mechipos, mineris, veneris, miner. We can go through each one. What does this mean? So it says by chametz that you shouldn't find any leaven, right? Yimatzeh, it shouldn't be found in your house any leaven for 7 days. And it says by Yosef, when they planted the goblet to frame Binyamin, right? So they did a search, and they started with Ruvain, and then they ended with Binyamin, and they found the goblet. So it says Vayimatzeh by chametz, and it says Vayimatzeh by this search, and by this search it also says Vayichapes, okay? Umetzia michipus, okay? Didei, great. So in the same pasuk it says Metzia and chipus. Vechipus mineris. And chipus, you can learn how you make the connection to neris. Dichsev, as it says by Isahi, in pasuk in Tzvanya, that the Eibishter says that at that time Achapes is Yerushalayim baneris. I will search through Jerusalem because people are being nudniks. So I'm going to search through Jerusalem with a candle to find the nudniks. So we see a connection between lichapes and neris. V'neris miner, and then plural neris from one ner. The Chsiv, as the pasuk says, ner Hashem nishmas adam chofes kochadri baten, that the candle of God is the soul of a person, and it searches in all of his insides, which is very interesting. All right, very good. Almost as if the soul is like a spy for God, right? How does God always know what you're doing? Well, because you have a neshama. We like to think of the neshama as this like very pure thing that's like chelek eloka mimal, this part of God that's inside of us. But I guess it comes with other strings attached. That part of God means that God always knows what's going on inside of you. I don't know if we always want God to know what's going on inside of us. Anyways, so that's how we know that bedikas hametz is with a candle, because we started out with yimatzeh. We made from yimatzeh, we were able to make connections to the chapes, from the chapes to neros, etc. So Tanat Rabbi Shmuel, we learned in the base measure to Rabbi Shmuel, Leile Yodalid, that on the night of the 14th, I assume it means the night between 13 and 14, Bodkim as a chametz l'orener, so we do bedikas chametz to the light of a candle. Afal and raya ledavar, and even though we can't prove this from psukim that you need to use a candle, but zecher ledavar, we can sort of make like an asmachta, we can like kind of base it on psukim in Navi. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, shivas yom sor leimatze lo yimatze. Well, it says in the Torah that for 7 days you can't find any leaven. V'omer vaychapis bagadol eichel v'katon kila vayimatze. It also says by Binyamin, which is also in the Torah, that they found the goblet. V'omer vayisai achapes is Yerushalayim b'neiris. And then it says in Tzfanya, which is Navi, that I will search in Jerusalem with candles. V'omer, and it also says ner Hashem nishmas adam chofes, that the candle of God is the soul of man, and it searches. So, my v'omer, how come we need this last proof? Meaning, why isn't it enough the pasuk in Tzfanya that makes the connection between searching and a candle? Why do we need the additional pasuk of ner Hashem nishmas adam? So, v'chitema, because if you're going to say hai ba'isahi kulahu dika amar achmana, right? If you're going to say that, yeah, the idea with the candle in Tzfanya, where God was searching Jerusalem with a candle, maybe you could say that God was trying to take it easy on us, right? That God was saying, Lo badikna la b'Yerushalayim b'nahora da'avuka d'nafish nahora tuva, right? God is saying, I didn't search through Jerusalem with a torch, which would be a lot more light, and I'd find a lot more worse stuff. Ela b'nahora d'shraga, rather I just searched with the candle, d'zuter nahora tvei, that is a much smaller light, the avon rabba mishtakach v'avon zutala mishtakach, that it'll really only just find the bad, the really bad stuff, but not all the nitty gritty bad stuff. So I might think that really a candle doesn't really search so well, and that is why God specifically used the candle, so that He won't find absolutely everything. So maybe it's not, maybe the candle isn't the best. Maybe we need other alternatives. So Tashma ne Hashem nishmas adam. Therefore, it says that the candle of God is the soul of man, right? Chofes kol chadrei baten, that it is good for searching all of the insides of a person. So we see that a candle is taka, a good searching mechanism. Implement. All right, very good. Chaver, that was Daf Zayin of Pesachim, another home run, right? Right. So let's review some of the topics that we learned. Being mevatel after bedikat, so we do bitul after, right? We say that any hametz should be like the dust of the earth after bedikas hametz, because just in case you'll find some bread after once hametz is already usher after 6 hours on Erev Pesach. So to avoid that case, and then you can't be mevatel it anymore because it's usher bana and it's not in your rishus, and it was like bor b'shus harabim, that even though it's not yours, you're still going to get in trouble for it. So we say avoid that whole thing by just doing bitul after bedika. We talked about moldy bread. The interesting thing about that was that you can assume that it's matzah and not bread, since you're finding it on Pesach, and you can assume that you did a bedikat before Pesach, and this must be from Pesach. We talked about the bracha that you make on bedikas chametz. Machlokes between Rav Papi in the name of Rava and Rav Papa in the name of Rava. Rav Papi says that the bracha is livaer chametz. So that was Rav Papi in the name of Rava. Rav Papa in the name of Rava says it's al biur chametz, and the bracha that we make in practice is al biur chametz. Making brachas over la siyasan, we discussed that. That is kind of a well-known concept, that we make brachas before we do things. So if we put on a talis or something, you make the bracha first and then put it on, right? So we generally make a bracha before we do the mitzvah. And then we discussed bedikat with a candle, that it does a good enough job. Chevra, I hope you enjoyed Daf Zayin of Pesachim. I'll see you tomorrow for Daf Ches. Peace.